During the horrific time of the Atlantic slave trade, millions of African lives were devalued, and the courses of enormous ships were stained with the blood of their victims. They were stripped of their humanity and traded off like cattle, forced to toil in a strange nation until death claimed them. It was a time of unimaginable tragedy when entire populations were sucked into the vortex of a system driven by greed and designed to profit from people's suffering. In this video, we will cover the intricate details and profound impact of the Atlantic slave trade, leaving no aspect unexplored. The Atlantic slave trade was one of the worst crimes against mankind, and its legacy will never be erased from history. Over 4 centuries, the enslavement and transit of millions of African people across the Atlantic Ocean fueled a brutal and prosperous economy. This bleak period in our history is symbolic of the darkest points of humanity and leaves a permanent scar on those who experience its effects. The Atlantic slave trade began in the 1480s when Portuguese ships started transporting Africans to work as enslaved laborers on sugar plantations in the Cape Verde and Madeira Islands in the eastern Atlantic. It involved transporting approximately 10 million to 12 million enslaved Africans all across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. This trade was part of the triangular trade system, where goods such as arms, textiles, and wine were sent from Europe to Africa. Enslaved people were transported from Africa to the Americas, and products like sugar and coffee were returned to Europe. Understanding the Atlantic slave trade requires delving into the experiences of enslaved persons who went through devastating events that intentionally separated them from their homes, families, and familiar surroundings. The process involved their capture in the African interior, transportation to the coast, sale to slave traders, a harrowing journey on a slave ship, and sale and enslavement in the Americas. Initially, the Portuguese mostly purchased Africans who had already been enslaved during tribal wars. However, as demand increased, they began venturing into the African interior to take captives forcibly. Other Europeans primarily remained on the coast and bought captives from Africans who transported them from the interior. Once captured, the Africans endured grueling journeys of up to 300 miles to reach the coast. 2 captives were often chained together at the ankle, and columns of captives were tied hard together with ropes around their necks. These enslaved people were kept in factories and awaited shipment. European slavers loaded around 12.5 million Africans onto Atlantic slave ships during a span of 366 years. Of these, approximately 11 million survived the treacherous Middle Passage and arrived in the Americas to face a life of enslavement. It means that 12 to 15% died during the journey. However, the number of Africans purchased by traders was even higher, as the journey across the Atlantic claimed the lives of approximately 1.2 to 2.4 million individuals, and millions more perished in seasoning camps in the Caribbean after they arrived in the New World. Millions died due to slave raids, wars, and transportation to the coast for sale to European slave traders. During the 1600s, the Dutch emerged as the leading traders of enslaved people, followed by the English and French in the 1700s. These European powers controlled approximately half of the Atlantic slave trade, sourcing a significant portion of their human cargo from the West African region between the Senegal and Niger rivers. In 1713, an agreement between Spain and Britain granted the British a monopoly on trading enslaved people with Spanish colonies. This agreement, known as the Asiento de Negros, allowed Britons to supply 4,800 enslaved Africans per year for 30 years to the Spanish colonies, with a contract assigned to the South Sea Company. Before 1600, only a few 100,000 Africans were transported to the Americas. However, the demand for enslaved labor skyrocketed in the 17th century with the growth of sugar plantations in the Caribbean and tobacco plantations in North America's Chesapeake region. The 18th century witnessed the largest influx of enslaved people, accounting for nearly 3/5 of the total volume of the Atlantic slave trade, according to historians' estimates. The impact of the slave trade on Africa was devastating. The economic incentives for warlords and tribes to engage in trade created an atmosphere of lawlessness and violence. The depopulation caused by capturing people for slavery and the constant fear of being captured disrupted economic and agricultural development across much of Western Africa. The majority of those captured were women in their childbearing years and young men who would have been starting families. European enslavers typically left behind the elderly, disabled, and dependent individuals who were the least able to contribute to their society's economic well-being. The Atlantic slave trade is commonly divided into two eras: the First and Second Atlantic systems. Only around 3% of enslaved individuals were traded between 1525 and 1600, which increased to 16% in the 17th century. The First Atlantic system involved the trade of enslaved Africans primarily to the American colonies of the Portuguese and Spanish empires. Initially, slavers transported Africans to Seville or the Canary Islands, and then exported them from Spain to colonies in Hispaniola and Puerto Rico, with 1 to 40 slaves per ship. The most infamous part of the Atlantic slave trade was the second passage, the Atlantic voyage from Africa to the Americas, usually to destinations like Brazil or the Caribbean islands. The conditions aboard slave ships were horrific, characterized by brutality, overcrowding, and unsanitary conditions. Hundreds of Africans were tightly packed into the lower decks for a voyage of approximately 5,000 miles, lasting from a few weeks to several months. The enslaved people were often chained together, unable to sit upright due to low ceilings. The extreme heat and lack of oxygen made the environment unbearable, with candles refusing to burn. Africans were allowed only a few hours outside on the upper decks daily to prevent insurrection. Historians estimate that around 15 and 25% of the enslaved Africans died on these voyages. Death rates decreased as the voyage duration reduced significantly over the centuries from the 16th to the 19th century. Mexico emerged as the largest market for slaves in Spanish America until the mid-17th century. The second passage was rife with atrocities and sexual abuse towards the captives, although the monetary value of slaves often mitigated such treatment. In a notorious incident aboard the slave ship Zong in 1781, during an infectious disease outbreak, Captain Luke Collingwood ordered more than 130 enslaved Africans to be thrown overboard to halt the spread of the disease. He then filed an insurance claim for the murdered slaves' value. Revolts by captives occasionally occurred, the most famous being the 1839 mutiny led by Joseph Cinque on the Spanish slave ship Amistad. The U.S. Supreme Court eventually ruled in favor of the African captives, ordering their return to their homelands. Slavery differed in Africa and the Americas. In Africa, slavery was not necessarily hereditary, and the children of slaves were considered free. However, in the Americas, children born to slave mothers were automatically enslaved. Racial and religious minorities were not the exclusive targets of slavery in West Africa as in European colonies. In certain regions, like Somalia, Bantu individuals were enslaved by ethnic Somalis. Some African kings, such as those in Dahomey, regularly sacrificed hundreds or thousands of slaves in rituals, and human sacrifices involving slaves were also documented in Cameroon. During the American Revolution, there was significant support in the Northern American colonies for ending the importation of enslaved people. However, it took more than 2 decades after the Revolution for Congress to make the importation of enslaved people illegal due to pressure from southern states. Denmark became the first country to ban the slave trade through legislation in 1792, which took effect in 1803. Britain followed suit and banned the slave trade in 1807, imposing severe fines for transporting slaves aboard British ships. The Royal Navy took measures to halt other nations' involvement in the slave trade and declared slavery equivalent to piracy, punishable by death. The United States Congress passed the Slave Trade Act of 1794, which prohibited the construction or outfitting of ships in the U.S. for use in the slave trade. Although the U.S. Constitution permitted the importation of slaves for 20 years, the act prohibiting importation of slaves went into effect on January 1, 1808, prohibiting imports from that day onward. Great Britain abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1833, and the British Navy actively opposed the Atlantic slave trade, using its ships to suppress slave trading operations. Brazil outlawed the trade in 1850, but the smuggling of newly enslaved individuals continued until the country finally abolished slavery in 1888. So there you have it all. What do you think of this darkest chapter of history? Do write us in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.